Why the man who doesn't need anyone is society's greatest threat. Carl Jung famously said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." Today, on Spiritual Wisdom, we are challenging the modern myth of the lone wolf. While society might fear the man who needs no one, true power isn't about severing ties. It's about mastering your own mind so you remain whole, regardless of who is beside you. By applying these Jungian principles to your daily life, you can move from a place of lonely detachment to a state of powerful, self-assured happiness. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Is it possible to be fully part of society while remaining truly independent? Share your perspective below. 1. Society is built on necessity and people who are automatically enough to create models. Have you ever stopped to consider who the most dangerous person in the world really is? Not in terms of physical violence, but in terms of disrupting the very fabric of our constructed reality. It is not the rebel who throws stones, nor the loud revolutionary screaming for attention. Rather, it is the quiet individual who is entirely at peace with themselves. To understand this, we must look at the foundation of our civilization. Society is built on necessity and people who are automatically enough to create models. This structure relies entirely on a cycle of dependency, where every individual serves as a cog in a machine, fueled by the desperate need for external validation, resources, and approval. When you look closely at the modern world, you realize that the economy is not just about money. It is an economy of emotional hunger. Everywhere you look, the mechanisms of this hunger are at work. Social media, advertising, dating, lifestyle trends are all based on making you feel lacking, not enough, needing others. These platforms are engineered to create a spiritual void within you, a hollow space that begs to be filled by a product, a like, or a partner. They whisper constant reminders that you are incomplete on your own, pushing you further away from true spirituality and deeper into a state of frantic attachment. But what happens when a person undergoes a profound spiritual awakening and realizes that the void is an illusion? A single person who fills in completely makes the whole system useless. When you realize you are whole, the advertisements lose their power. The social pressure fades into background noise, and the intricate web of societal expectation dissolves because it has nothing left to hook into. This brings us to a profound and unsettling truth. The man who needs no one is the greatest threat because he cannot be controlled. In a world that governs through leverage, the man who has no leverage points becomes invisible to the systems of power. Think about the energy required to maintain the status quo. It requires a population that is terrified of being ostracized. However, the autonomous individual operates on a different frequency entirely. He does not need recognition, does not need attention, is not terminated by the fear of rejection. Because he has found the universe within himself, the external world's carrot and stick approach becomes irrelevant. He walks through life with a quiet confidence that unnerves those who rely on hierarchy and submission. Consequently, society cannot manipulate him through isolation, shame, or community pressure. You cannot threaten a man with loneliness if he finds his solitude to be a sanctuary. You cannot shame a man who validates himself from within. And you cannot pressure a soul that answers only to its own internal truth. This is the essence of true freedom. By stepping out of the cycle of need, such a person reclaims their power, proving that the ultimate act of rebellion is not to destroy the system, but simply to no longer need what it offers. This is the path of the awakened soul, a path that leads not to isolation, but to a sovereignty so complete that it shakes the very foundations of the collective unconscious. Comment below, I am complete within myself, if you are ready to stop seeking validation and start embracing your true power. 2. The person who knows how to be alone is the only one who is capable of independent thinking. The person who knows how to be alone is the only one who is capable of independent thinking. And this realization is the first step toward reclaiming your mind from the collective noise that seeks to drown it out. When you look closely at the structure of modern life, you will see that society is engineered to keep you in a state of perpetual dependency, constantly tethered to the opinions of others, the validation of social circles, and the relentless stream of media that dictates what you should fear and what you should desire. You are taught that loneliness is a pathology to be cured rather than a sanctuary to be entered. But this is a deception designed to keep you predictable. By avoiding solitude, you inadvertently surrender your sovereignty, allowing your thoughts to become nothing more than echoes of the crowd. To break free, you must embrace the silence where true spirituality resides, recognizing that the ability to stand apart is not an act of rebellion for its own sake, but a necessary condition for sanity. Like Marcus Aurelius, who ruled an empire yet found his true strength within the fortress of his own private reflections, or Nietzsche, who dared to scale the terrified heights of human consciousness without a safety net. The person who thinks alone will not be controlled by the travel, the media, or the crowd. These figures understood that wisdom does not come from the consensus of the majority. It comes from the grueling, solitary work of introspection. When you are constantly surrounded by the herd, you naturally adopt their pace, their panic, and their prejudices. You lose the sharp edge of your unique perspective because the pressure to conform smooths you into a rounded, manageable pebble in the stream of society. However, when you step away, you engage in profound spiritual development that strips away the false masks you wear to please the world. You begin to see the mechanisms of control for what they are, and you realize that the travel and the media are often just distractions meant to keep you from looking inward. This journey into solitude creates a form of self-thinking that defies the algorithms of control. For self-thinking is thinking without the ability to be predicted, and this unpredictability makes society afraid. The systems of the world rely on statistical averages and mass behavior to function efficiently. They need you to buy what everyone else buys, fear what everyone else fears, and react exactly as the data models suggest you will. But the man or woman who does not need anyone, who has found emotional and intellectual self-reliance, becomes a variable that cannot be accounted for. You become dangerous not because you are violent, but because you are ungovernable. You no longer require the external validation that society uses as a leash to guide your behavior. This is the ultimate threat to the status quo, a mind that cannot be leveraged by fear or seduced by popularity. This path is the essence of true spirituality, shifting your focus from external rituals to internal liberation. It is a transition from being a passive consumer of culture to becoming a creator of your own reality. By learning to be alone, you are not rejecting humanity, but rather, you are purifying your contribution to it. You stop looking for a savior in political leaders or social movements and realize that the strength you have been seeking has been dormant within you all along, waiting for the noise to subside so it could finally be heard. This is the power of the solitary thinker. To stand amidst the chaos of the world, grounded in a deep spiritual development that no external force can shake, perfectly capable, perfectly whole, and terrifyingly free. 3. They have overcome the 3 things that society uses to control people. Have you ever wondered why the person who is utterly content in their own solitude makes everyone else so uncomfortable? There is a profound, almost unspoken realization in our culture that the man who needs no one is society's greatest threat, not because he is harmful, but because he is uncontrollable. Society functions on a transactional basis of need. It relies on your hunger for validation and your fear of exclusion to keep you in line. However, when an individual transcends these dependencies through deep spiritual wisdom, they break the 3 invisible chains that bind the collective. The first, and perhaps most pervasive of these chains, is the addiction to current recognition and the desperate, gnawing need for approval. Most people live their lives performing for an invisible audience, terrifyingly obedient to the status quo, because they fear the silence of irrelevance. But the man who has stepped out of this cycle has realized that popularity is a prison. He understands that if you live for people's acceptance, you will die from their rejection. And by removing his self-worth from the hands of others, he becomes impossible to bribe with praise or destroy with criticism. Once the addiction to approval is shattered, the truly free individual moves on to the second, more difficult challenge. He is not afraid to face himself. While the majority of the world distracts itself with noise and entertainment to avoid looking into the mirror, this man dives straight into the depths of his own psyche. This is the essence of the work described by Carl Jung, who taught us that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. By confronting his own flaws, his suppressed aggression, and his deepest fears, this man removes the levers that society usually pulls to manipulate people. You cannot shame a man who has already accepted his own darkness. You cannot use guilt as a weapon against someone who has made peace with his shadows. This internal fortitude creates an armor that makes him impervious to the moral posturing of the crowd, rendering him a glitch in the matrix of social control because he possesses a self-knowledge that is rarer and more powerful than any external status. This journey of self-mastery culminates in overcoming the third and final control mechanism, the emotional attributes of others. We live in a world of emotional contagion, where if the mob is angry, you are expected to be angry, and if the news is fearful, you are expected to be afraid. Society demands that you synchronize your emotional state with the collective pulse. However, the man who has attained this level of spiritual wisdom observes these waves of emotion without drowning in them. He realizes that when no one can control your emotions, you become dangerous in the eyes of the system because you become unpredictable. He does not react. He responds. He is the calm eye in the center of the storm, an unshakable pillar that refuses to vibrate at the frequency of chaos surrounding him. in a world that demands conformity and emotional submission. Remaining calm and self-possessed is the ultimate act of rebellion, proving that the most powerful thing you can be is not a leader of men, but a master of yourself. Don't forget to subscribe for more wisdom on breaking free from societal control and reclaiming your true independence. 4. They have 4 products that make them dangerous. The paradox that Carl Jung identified is that the individual who has achieved true spirituality is often viewed as society's greatest threat, not because of distinct malice, but because of an untamable independence that renders the usual levers of control ineffective. This specific type of dangerous person possesses 4 psychological products that function as an impenetrable armor against manipulation, effectively severing the puppet strings that move the collective. The first and most foundational of these is absolute honesty with oneself. While the majority of society exhausts itself maintaining a polished facade, hiding their insecurities and darker impulses behind a veil of politeness, this individual engages in the brutal, necessary work of confronting his own shadow. He stares unflinchingly at his failures, his greed, and his aggression, acknowledging them as parts of his whole. By doing so, he becomes immune to the weapon of shame. You cannot expose a man who has already exposed himself to his own conscience, nor can you seduce him with flattery when he knows the exact measure of his own worth. This profound self-knowledge naturally catalyzes a genuine spiritual awakening, leading to the second defensive layer, the autonomy of life values. We live in a world suffused with artificial glamour, where success is dictated by external metrics, wealth, applause, and status. Yet this man refuses to purchase what the crowd is selling. He understands that the glitter of societal approval is often a trap designed to enforce conformity, so he pivots inward to self-create value. He does not rely on the fluctuating market of public opinion to tell him what is precious. Instead, he mines his own meaning from the depths of his experience. Because his values are homegrown and not imported from the culture, he cannot be bribed by the promise of prestige or threatened by the loss of reputation, making him a glitch in the system of consumerist desire. As this detachment from external validation deepens, it births the third and perhaps most stabilizing trait, emotional self-sufficiency. Most human interactions are secretly transactional, a silent barter where people trade compliance for affection or agreement for safety. But the self-sufficient man has retired from this exhausting game. He is not an emotional beggar extending a cup for validation, nor is he a tyrant demanding attention. Rather, he has discovered a wellspring of contentment within his own being. This does not mean he is cold or unfeeling, but rather that his emotional state is not held hostage by the moods or judgments of others. When one no longer requires the permission of the group to feel whole, the fear of ostracization, the herd's most powerful whip, loses its sting, leaving him standing firm while others are swept away by the currents of collective hysteria. It is on this bedrock of emotional stability that the rarest quality is built: intellectual courage. Because he is not afraid of being alone, and because he does not need the comfort of consensus, he dares to think what others are afraid to think. While the collective mind retreats into safe, approved dogmas to avoid the anxiety of the unknown, this individual ventures into the forbidden territories of thought, questioning sacred traditions and challenging the narratives that keep the masses asleep. This is the ultimate danger he presents. He functions as a living mirror reflecting the reality that compliance is a choice. By possessing absolute honesty, autonomous values, emotional self-sufficiency, and intellectual courage, he becomes immune to manipulation, proving that the chains of society are only as strong as our fear of breaking them. 5. Society fear enough because they break the economic, political, and psychological system. The man who stands alone, needing no one to validate his existence, is often viewed not merely as an outsider, but as society's greatest threat, because he fundamentally dismantles the economic, political, and psychological systems that rely on collective dependency to function. When you begin to peel back the layers of modern civilization, you realize that the entire structure is engineered to keep you in a state of constant want, convincing you that you are incomplete without the next product, the next promotion, or the next round of applause. However, when you commit to true spiritual development, you effectively unplug from this matrix of artificial need, and that act of disconnection is perceived as dangerous because it interrupts the flow of commerce and control. The system relies on your insecurity to fuel its economic engine. It needs you to consume goods not for survival, but to impress people you do not know, and to soothe an internal void that material things can never actually fill. By realizing that your worth is intrinsic and not tied to what you own, you stop participating in the frantic race for economic survival that keeps the masses distracted and obedient, thereby rendering the tools of consumerism useless against you. Once you have liberated yourself from the cycle of consumption, you inevitably become immune to the mechanisms of control that society uses to dictate your behavior, specifically the chase for status and location. The world is designed to keep you chasing after a better place, a corner office, a prestigious neighborhood, or a higher social rank, because these desires act as leverage that authority figures can use to direct your path. If you do not desire the rewards they dangle in front of you, they lose the ability to manipulate you. Through deep spirituality, you understand that your internal state is the only location that matters, and this realization strips society of its control tools. You become ungovernable, not because you are rebellious in a chaotic sense, but because you cannot be bribed with power or prestige that you do not value. This terrified the established order because a man who cannot be bought is a man who cannot be owned. And if this mindset were to spread, the hierarchical structures of power would crumble under the weight of their own irrelevance. This autonomy naturally fosters a form of independent thinking that is antithetical to the herd mentality required for a compliant populace. When you no longer look to others for cues on how to live, you begin to question the narratives that are fed to you, making it incredibly difficult for you to be directed by political rhetoric or social pressure. Society thrives on a unified consensus, a shared hallucination of what is important and true. But your spiritual development grants you the clarity to see through these illusions. You become a variable that cannot be calculated or predicted, a solitary thinker who creates his own path rather than following the well-worn trails of convention. This intellectual sovereignty is threatening because it challenges the assumption that the majority is always right, proving that wisdom often whispers in solitude while foolishness screams in the crowd. Perhaps the most profound and unsettling reason the self-sufficient man is feared is that his very existence serves as a polished mirror, forcing those around him to confront the reality of their own mental prison. When you engage in the hard work of self-making, building a life defined by authenticity rather than approval, you unintentionally highlight the compromises and cowardice of those who have chosen to conform. Your freedom reminds them that the door to their cage is unlocked and that they have stayed inside simply because they are afraid to step out. This realization often manifests as hostility toward you, for it is far easier for society to label you as aloof, arrogant, or dangerous than it is for them to admit that they have traded their souls for a false sense of security. By needing no one, you expose the fragility of the collective need, proving that the chains binding humanity are self-imposed and that true liberation is always just one conscious choice away. As we realize why society fears the self-sufficient man, take a moment to commit to your own individuation. Comment, "I choose freedom," to mark your place on this journey. Now, let's move on to the next vital insight. 6. The difference between loneliness and toxicity makes self-sufficient people dangerous. Have you ever noticed how the person who is perfectly content in their own company often makes the rest of the world incredibly uncomfortable, almost as if their silence is a loud act of rebellion? To truly understand this dynamic, you must first recognize the profound psychological distinction between loneliness and solitude. Because while society often confuses the two, they are actually opposites. Loneliness is a state of desperate lack, a gnawing emptiness where you feel incomplete without external validation. It is a mathematical equation resulting in zero. In stark contrast, true self-sufficiency is a state of abundance where you contain the entire universe within yourself. As the great Carl Jung famously noted in his spiritual wisdom, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." The person who is awakened to their own inner richness is not lonely. They are simply self-contained. And this distinction is exactly what makes them dangerous to the status quo. Consider for a moment that our entire modern economic and social structure is built upon the foundation of a void, a carefully manufactured hole in your soul that screams to be filled. The system is designed to thrive on your insecurity, constantly whispering that you are not enough until you buy this car, wear those clothes, or join that specific social circle. It relies on the equation that loneliness equals a lack that must be fixed through consumption. However, the man who is at home in his own skin requires nothing to fill a void, because there is no void to begin with. When you possess this kind of inner wholeness, you become a nightmare for the consumerist machine, because you cannot be seduced by the promise of completion when you are already whole. You stop buying remedies for a sickness you do not have. And when you stop buying, the system loses a customer, and the machinery of control begins to malfunction. This is why the self-sufficient person is often labeled as toxic or antisocial by the crowd. It is a defense mechanism used by the collective to protect its own fragility. As the philosopher Aristotle observed, he who is unable to live in society, or who has no need because he is sufficient for himself, must be either a beast or a god. To a society that relies on dependent masses, Such a man is perceived as a threat because he is unreachable and ungovernable. He acts as a mirror, reflecting the dependency of everyone else back at them, forcing them to confront their own terrifying inability to sit quietly with their own thoughts. By embracing the spiritual wisdom of Carl Jung, you realize that stepping away from the herd is not an act of arrogance, but an act of sanity. Ultimately, the man who needs no one is society's greatest threat, not because he harms others, but because he proves that we are free to break the chains of dependency. And in a world built on spiritual slavery, freedom is the most dangerous idea of all. 7. When you don't need anyone, you become naturally attractive, but not for the sake of attraction. When you reach the profound realization that you do not need anyone to complete you, you inadvertently trigger a shift in the universe around you, becoming naturally attractive not through effort or manipulation, but through the sheer gravitational pull of your own wholeness. This is the great paradox of social interaction. The moment you cease grasping for affection is the moment it flows toward you in abundance. When you don't depend on anyone for your emotional stability, your relationships undergo a radical alchemy, transforming from transactional exchanges of need into pure celebrations of connection. Because you are no longer asking your partner or your friends to carry the heavy burden of your self-worth or to act as a crutch for your insecurities, the dynamic becomes lighter, freer, and infinitely better. You are able to see others as they truly are, rather than as characters in the script of your own loneliness. And this clarity allows for a love that is voluntary rather than mandatory. This sense of inner sovereignty bleeds seamlessly into every aspect of your existence, causing your work to become not only more efficient, but deeply masterful. When you are no longer working solely to appease an authority figure or to desperately prove your value to a judgmental world, you strip away the anxiety that usually clogs the creative process. You operate with a laser-like focus because your motivation has shifted from the extrinsic fear of failure to an intrinsic drive for excellence. In this state, the work itself becomes a form of meditation, a practice of spirituality where the ego is set aside, allowing your true potential to function without the friction of needing constant applause. Life, consequently, becomes more meaningful, not because the external circumstances have changed, but because your internal landscape has undergone a true spiritual awakening. You stop looking for meaning in the approval of the crowd and start generating it from the wellspring of your own soul, realizing that you are the architect of your own joy. It is precisely this self-sufficiency that renders you dangerous in the most magnificent and liberating sense of the word. A man who needs nothing is a man who cannot be controlled, for he has no price tag and no weak point for society to exploit. When you derive your value from within, you cannot be bought with flattery, you cannot be coerced by fear, and you cannot be manipulated by the threat of being cast out. You have become an immovable object in a world of shifting sands, a person who walks their own path regardless of whether the crowd follows or jeers. This is the ultimate threat to a system built on dependency and conformity, yet it is the ultimate victory for the individual. You are attractive, powerful, and free, not because you have conquered the world, but because you have conquered the need for the world to validate your existence. To master the power of non-attachment, seal your commitment. Comment below, "I chase nothing," to acknowledge that you attract what belongs to you simply by being yourself. In the end, total isolation isn't freedom. It's a risk. As Jung warns, when we remove ourselves from the mirror of society, we lose the ability to check our own darkness. The goal of spiritual growth is not to escape others, but to understand ourselves through them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share it to help us grow. Make sure to subscribe to the Spiritual Wisdom channel and hit that bell icon to get notified as soon as our next video goes live. The psychology of people who have gone through too much. Out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. The most massive characters are seared with scars, Carl Jung once said, and nowhere is this truer than in the hidden psychology of those who have been through too much. Today on Spiritual Wisdom, we explore how deep pain reshapes the mind, strengthens the spirit, and for many, becomes the doorway to true self-mastery and inner freedom. As you listen, ask yourself, how has your own suffering shaped who you are today? And are you using it as a wound or as a source of power? Share your reflections in the comments as we begin this profound journey together. 1. Emotional collapse happens quietly. Emotional collapse rarely arrives with drama or obvious warning signs. For those who have been through too much, the breaking point does not announce itself with chaos. It arrives quietly, internally, invisibly. It is not the kind of tiredness that sleep can fix, but a deep inner collapse that forms after carrying emotional weight far beyond what the human nervous system was designed to hold. On the surface, they may still function, still speak, still move through daily life, but inside, something essential has begun to give way in silence. This kind of collapse is not sudden. It is the slow accumulation of unprocessed grief, repeated disappointments, suppressed fear, unspoken rage, and long-term emotional responsibility that was never meant to be carried alone. Day after day, the pressure builds without release, like a structure bearing more weight than it was engineered for, until one quiet moment when nothing appears to happen, yet everything changes. There is no external explosion, no breakdown that draws attention, only an internal surrender, where the psyche reaches its limit and quietly stops striving to hold it all together. People who experience this silent collapse often do not look broken to the world. They still show up. They still smile. They still perform the roles expected of them. But inside, they feel emptied, disconnected, emotionally hollow. What once mattered no longer moves them the same way. What once energized them now feels distant. This numbness is not peace. It is the nervous system pulling inward after enduring too much without safety or relief. Carl Jung captured this inner dynamic when he said, "What we resist persists, because suppressed suffering does not disappear. It reshapes the inner world from within." This is often the hidden gateway into spirituality and spiritual awakening, not through light or inspiration at first, but through disillusionment and emotional exhaustion. The collapse quietly strips away the illusion of endless strength, the identity built around survival, the belief that one must endure everything without pause. As the old emotional structure weakens, the person is forced inward into reflection, into solitude, into the deep confrontation with their own inner landscape, where pain, meaning, and transformation coexist. Rather than destroying the individual, this quiet collapse begins to reorganize them. Priorities shift, sensitivities sharpen, tolerance for superficiality fades. The person becomes more discerning, more selective, less willing to betray themselves for approval. This change is not loud or performative. It is subtle, slow, and deeply internal. The soul, no longer able to survive through suppression alone, begins to seek truth instead of endurance, depth instead of distraction, authenticity instead of adaptation. Those who have gone through too much often emerge with a presence that feels different, not hardened, but weighted with awareness. They have seen the cost of emotional denial. They understand the dangers of carrying too much alone. And without consciously choosing it, they step onto a path where healing is no longer optional. The silent collapse becomes the moment where unconscious survival gives way to conscious transformation, where the psyche stops merely enduring and begins, quietly, to awaken. If you feel this, declare it below. I am stronger than my pain. 2. Resilience is a survival response, not strength. Resilience is often misunderstood and deeply romanticized, but for those who have gone through too much, it is not a symbol of strength or peace. It is a survival response carved into the nervous system by years of pressure, disappointment, and emotional overload. Their calmness is frequently mistaken for stability, control, or even wisdom. Yet beneath that still surface often lies emotional numbness, created as a shield against constant strain. This numbness is not chosen. It is learned. It develops when there is no safe space to fall apart, when vulnerability leads to more harm instead of comfort, and when enduring becomes the only option. What people praise as strength is often a quiet form of self-protection, a way of staying functional when life offers no room to feel. Their resilience is not confidence. It is an automatic adaptation to a life that gives them no other choice. Over time, this adaptation becomes so natural that even the person who carries it may forget what it felt like to be emotionally open, to feel joy without calculation, to rest without guilt. From a psychological perspective, this form of endurance is not rooted in self-belief, but in self-preservation. The system learns to stay alert, to expect impact, to anticipate loss, and to conserve emotion because expression once felt dangerous. Carl Jung would describe this as the formation of a powerful persona, a mask built for survival in the outer world, while the inner self, wounded and sensitive, retreats into shadow. On the outside, they become reliable, composed, unshakable. On the inside, they may feel disconnected, detached, or strangely empty, unable to access their own softness without fear. This is why so many people who appear the strongest are often the most exhausted, not in body, but in spirit. Their identity has been shaped around endurance rather than expression, around control rather than connection. The danger is not in the armor itself. The danger is forgetting that the armor is not the skin. This is where spirituality and spiritual development quietly begin to play a deeper role, not as an escape from pain, but as a return to what was shut down. When survival mode has lasted too long, the soul begins to seek something beyond endurance. You may feel this as restlessness that no success can satisfy, as a quiet longing for meaning that no distraction can silence. Spirituality, in its purest form, does not demand more strength from you. It asks for honesty. It asks you to recognize that what protected you once may now be limiting your ability to feel alive. Spiritual development begins when you realize that emotional numbness is not peace, and constant resilience is not freedom. It begins when safety is no longer measured by how much you can tolerate, but by how safe you feel being real. True growth does not come from pushing harder against the world, but from learning that you no longer have to brace for impact at every moment. The shift from survival to meaning is one of the most difficult inner transitions a person can make, because it requires letting go of the identity that once kept you alive. The deeper lesson beneath all of this is that resilience saved you, but it is not meant to define you. The calm that came from numbness helped you endure, but it cannot nourish your future. The emotional shutdown that once prevented collapse may now be blocking intimacy, joy, and peace. What appears as strength to the world may feel like quiet isolation within your own chest. Healing does not mean forgetting what you survived. It means no longer living inside the nervous system of that survival. When you move from automatic endurance into conscious presence, when you allow yourself to feel without drowning and trust without losing yourself, you step into a higher level of spiritual development, not as someone who is unbreakable, but as someone who is whole. 3. Their maturity was forced, not nurtured. Their maturity was forced, not nurtured. And if this truth belongs to you, it means you did not grow up because life gently guided you forward, but because it cornered you into becoming strong before you were ready. You learned composure not through safety, but through survival. You learned restraint not through wisdom, but through necessity. On the outside, you appear calm, thoughtful, emotionally intelligent, and steady. But beneath that surface lives the memory of having to grow up without the freedom to be a child, without the protection that allows softness to develop naturally. Carl Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." And often, forced maturity is born from this very weight being required to carry emotional responsibility that was never meant for young shoulders. You learned how to read the room instead of being held in one. You learned how to regulate your emotions because no one else could regulate theirs around you. You learned how to stay quiet, how to stay useful, how to stay composed, because chaos punished vulnerability. While other children were forming their identity through play and safety, you were forming yours through observation, endurance, and adaptation. That is not a failure of character. It is a testimony of resilience. But it also leaves a hidden cost. You became wise long before you were allowed to be innocent. You became responsible before you were allowed to be protected. You became strong before you were allowed to be soft. People admire your stability, but they rarely see what it took to build it. They see your calm during conflict, but not the years when fear taught your nervous system how to stay alert. They see your emotional control, but not the nights when you had to soothe yourself in silence. They see your strength, but not the loneliness that carved it into you. And yet this is where spiritual wisdom begins to awaken, because survival forged perception inside you. Carl Jung taught that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. And your roots went deep into hardship, pain, and emotional absence, not because you chose the depth, but because you were pushed into it. This forced maturity gives you the ability to sense what others feel without words. It trained you to notice shifts in energy, tone, and intention. It taught you to anticipate emotional storms before they arrived. This is not anxiety. It is intelligence shaped by experience. But when survival becomes identity, rest begins to feel unsafe. Softness begins to feel unfamiliar. Receiving care begins to feel uncomfortable. You may feel guilty when you are not being useful, uneasy when there is too much peace, and restless when there is nothing to fix. Strength became your armor long before it had the chance to become your choice. Carl Jung's spiritual wisdom reveals that what remains unconscious controls our lives, and what becomes conscious transforms us. Your forced maturity does not need to remain your cage. It can become your foundation for transformation. Healing does not mean becoming weak. It means becoming whole. It means allowing the child who never felt safe to finally exhale inside the adult who learned how to survive. It means realizing that your discipline, your composure, and your endurance do not need to disappear for softness to exist beside them. True maturity is not emotional numbness. It is not constant control. It is not endless self-sacrifice. Real maturity is the ability to feel deeply without collapsing, to set boundaries without guilt, to rest without shame, and to receive without fear. When you allow this shift to happen, you stop living only as the survivor and begin living as the integrated self. You no longer move through the world scanning for danger. You begin to move through it, choosing presence. The strength that once kept you alive now becomes the strength that allows you to heal. Your pain did not make you broken. It made you perceptive. It did not make you cold. It made you discerning. It did not make you weak. It made you inwardly unshakable. This is the paradox Carl Jung pointed toward again and again. The wound is often the very place where the light enters. And when you finally allow yourself to soften without fear of losing control, you enter a higher state of spiritual wisdom, where power and compassion no longer exist as opposites, but as reflections of the same awakened consciousness. Do you resonate with this? If you do, declare it boldly in the comments. My strength was forged through what I survived. 4. Hypervigilance and overthinking are learned defenses. Hypervigilance and overthinking are not random habits or personality flaws. They are learned defenses shaped by survival. When a person lives for too long in emotional chaos, the brain quietly rewires itself to stay alive in an unpredictable environment. Instead of relaxing into the present moment, the mind becomes hyper-aware of everything. Tone changes, facial expressions, silence, tension in the room, because safety has never been consistent. Over time, this constant scanning becomes automatic. The nervous system learns that danger does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it creeps in through subtle shifts, unfinished sentences, delayed replies, or an unfamiliar look in someone's eyes. What looks like anxiety from the outside is, in truth, a highly trained internal alarm system built from repeated emotional overwhelm. Overthinking grows from the same root. When pain has arrived without warning too many times, the mind begins to rehearse every possible future scenario in advance. Conversations are replayed endlessly. Words are analyzed, reanalyzed, and weighed for hidden meaning. Every decision is examined from many angles, not because the person enjoys mental noise, but because some part of the psyche believes that prediction equals protection. If you can anticipate the blow, maybe you can soften it. If you can read the room fast enough, maybe you can avoid the explosion altogether. Overthinking is not the love of complexity. It is the fear of being caught unprepared when emotional danger strikes again. Carl Jung's insight that neurosis often substitutes for legitimate suffering explains this pattern with striking clarity. When pain cannot be safely expressed, it does not disappear. It changes shape. The grief that was never allowed, the fear that was never soothed, and the confusion that was never explained all transform into hyper-alertness and mental overdrive. Instead of collapsing, the psyche tightens its grip on reality. It stays sharp, awake, and restless. The result is a person who appears tense, sensitive, or guarded, yet beneath that surface lies a system that learned to stay functional in conditions that once felt unbearable. From the perspective of spirituality, this transformation is deeply significant. What once trapped awareness inside fear can later become the gateway to spiritual awakening. Hyper-awareness, when healed, becomes intuition. Sensitivity, when no longer ruled by threat, becomes emotional intelligence and empathy. The same nervous system that once scanned for danger can learn to scan for truth, alignment, and inner peace. Spirituality teaches that nothing in the psyche is wasted. Every adaptation carries hidden potential. Even defenses forged in pain can be reshaped into tools of wisdom when safety is slowly restored. Healing does not mean forcing the mind to stop being alert overnight. It begins with teaching the nervous system that the constant emergency has passed. Through stable relationships, self-trust, breath awareness, and grounded daily rituals, the body gradually learns new signals of safety. The mind no longer has to race ahead to survive. Overthinking slowly shifts into discernment. Hypervigilance softens into presence. The soul, once on permanent guard, begins to rest without guilt. In this transition, many experience a quiet but powerful spiritual awakening. The realization that who they became to survive is not who they must remain to live. When viewed through spiritual wisdom, these patterns are not signs of brokenness. They are signatures of endurance. The brain did exactly what it needed to do in order to survive emotional chaos. Now, in a new season of life, those same patterns are being invited to transform. What once protected against danger can now protect peace. What once guarded against loss can now open the heart to trust again. In this way, hypervigilance and overthinking are revealed not as permanent cages, but as temporary structures the soul built on its path toward deeper awareness, healing, and true spirituality. 5. They carry invisible skills, but also invisible exhaustion. They carry invisible skills, but also invisible exhaustion, and you may recognize this in yourself, because you can sense tension before anyone speaks. Read between the lines when people only offer fragments of truth. Calm others when their emotions overflow, and hold space for those who unknowingly lean on your strength. Yet beneath all of this, you are quietly exhausted in ways few will ever understand. You retreat instead of rest, because retreat feels safer than slowing down. And you help others instead of asking for help, because somewhere along the way, you learned that being useful was safer than being vulnerable. This is not a flaw in your character, but a survival pattern written into your nervous system. A pattern Carl Jung would describe as the psyche adapting by becoming hyper-aware and hyper-capable, even when the soul aches for gentleness. People naturally gravitate toward you because your presence feels steady, your insight feels comforting, and your energy feels grounding. Yet every time you give support that you never receive, your inner world thins a little more, creating a quiet imbalance that spirituality calls the wounded healer, the one who guides others with wisdom while silently carrying their own unspoken fatigue. You became this way because life demanded that you grow up quickly, read emotional landscapes accurately, and navigate chaos with maturity you should never have been forced to develop so early. Over time, being calm became your duty, being perceptive became your defense, and being strong became your identity, until you no longer remembered what it felt like to be held, supported, or understood without having to first earn it. This invisible exhaustion grows heavier because your compassion flows outward far more easily than it flows inward, leaving you spiritually capable but emotionally drained, wise but weary, empathetic but under-nurtured. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And the darkness you carry is not a threat, but a message, a sign that your soul is tired of being the container for everyone else's storms while having no shelter of its own. Your exhaustion is not just physical. It is the fatigue of constantly managing, sensing, absorbing, and healing without pause. You have spent years being the emotional anchor in every room, the one who understands before being understood, the one who carries what others cannot name. And this creates a spiritual imbalance where your giving far exceeds your receiving. When you never ask for help, your relationships become one-directional. When you never rest authentically, your mind becomes crowded. When you never allow softness, your heart becomes overstretched. This is why the most profound step in your spiritual development is not becoming stronger, but becoming softer with yourself, learning that rest is not a reward, boundaries are not weapons, and asking for support is not proof of weakness, but evidence of wisdom. The deeper truth is that your sensitivity is not meant to be a burden. It is a gift that must be protected, nurtured, and honored. Your invisible skills, reading emotions, calming storms, guiding others, are extraordinary, but they require replenishment to remain blessings rather than weights. Your exhaustion is a signal that your soul is asking to be included in the compassion you so freely give. Your journey forward is not about carrying more, but carrying differently. Not about enduring silently, but allowing yourself to be supported openly. And not about proving strength, but reclaiming balance. The lesson is simple. Your empathy deserves boundaries. Your spirit deserves rest. And your heart deserves the same care you have always given to others. Don't forget to subscribe for more spiritual wisdom on transforming invisible strength and silent exhaustion into true inner power. 6. Vulnerability feels dangerous. Vulnerability no longer feels like a place of softness or safety when you have been hurt too many times. Instead, it feels like standing exposed in the middle of a storm with nothing to protect you. You do not struggle with emotional intimacy because you lack depth or feeling, but because each time you once opened your heart, it was followed by pain, misunderstanding, betrayal, or sudden instability. Your nervous system learned to associate openness with danger, so now even when love appears gentle, your body still hesitates. You may long for closeness, but at the same time, you fear what closeness once cost you. As a result, you open yourself in layers, not all at once, not out of manipulation or control, but out of an instinct for survival that has been trained through experience. People may misread your caution as distance, coldness, or emotional unavailability. But inside, what truly exists is a heart that has been wounded deeply and refuses to be shattered again. You reveal truths slowly, carefully observing how the other person responds, watching for consistency, emotional safety, and respect. This slow opening is not a weakness. It is a form of spiritual wisdom shaped by experience. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain," and your guarded nature is evidence of how deeply you have already been pushed into awareness through suffering. You learned that not everyone who listens knows how to hold your truth, and not every space is safe for your emotions. You may find that you are incredibly capable of supporting others, understanding their emotions, and offering compassion. Yet when it comes to your own wounds, you grow quiet. Somewhere in your past, your feelings were either dismissed, misunderstood, or used against you. So now your inner world feels like sacred ground that must be protected. You no longer speak just to be heard. You wait to be understood. Carl Jung also taught that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And for you, accepting your fear of vulnerability is part of that terrifying honesty. You are not broken for protecting yourself. You adapted. Your caution is not rooted in distrust of others alone, but in memory stored deep within your nervous system. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Even when logic tells you that someone is kind, your subconscious still asks, "Is it safe this time?" That is why you move slowly in emotional connection, testing safety through time, consistency, and behavior instead of words. Just as someone who has been burned once will instinctively pull their hand away from heat, you instinctively pull back from total emotional exposure. This is not weakness. This is conditioning shaped by survival. Through the lens of spirituality and the insights of Carl Jung, your guarded heart is not a flaw, but a threshold. Your boundaries are not walls built to block love. They are sacred gates that protect what is tender and real within you. Spiritual wisdom does not demand that you tear down every defense all at once. Instead, it invites you to become conscious of why those defenses exist and to soften them only where safety has been earned. You are not meant to give full access to everyone who shows interest in you. Trust is not immediate for those who have gone through too much. It is built slowly, carefully, and with discernment. At the same time, healing begins when you realize that your past is not a prophecy for every future connection. Not everyone will repeat the patterns that wounded you. Growth does not mean forcing yourself into vulnerability before you feel ready. It means learning how to recognize safer environments and allowing yourself to open at your own pace. Your sensitivity is not a liability. It is evidence of how deeply you once trusted and how deeply you still hope. Vulnerability may still feel dangerous, but with time, awareness, and self-compassion guided by spiritual wisdom and the teachings of Carl Jung, it can slowly transform from a threat into a bridge toward relationships that honor your emotional truth. 7. They love deeply but fear abandonment. People who have gone through too much often love with a depth that feels rare, steady, and unwavering. Yet hidden inside, that devotion is a quiet fear shaped by earlier wounds. They love wholeheartedly because they know what it feels like to receive too little. And this history gives their affection a purity that few can understand. Their loyalty is intense, their emotional intuition is sharp, and their sensitivity to subtle changes in behavior is not an overreaction. It is a survival response formed in moments when inconsistency meant danger, withdrawal, or emotional abandonment. As Carl Jung said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain, and for souls shaped by hardship, spirituality and spiritual awakening are often born from learning to navigate a world where love was unpredictable and safety was never guaranteed, because they grew up or lived through environments where they had to observe small emotional cues to protect themselves. They learned to read people deeply, noticing tone shifts, energy drops, and even silence. A late reply, a distracted voice, or a moment of distance may feel small to others, but to them, it can trigger an old wound, reminding them of times when affection faded without explanation. Their hearts remember the pattern long before their minds do, and this memory often makes them cautious, even when they desperately want to trust. Yet their sensitivity is not weakness. It is emotional intelligence refined by experience. These people became intuitive long before they understood the meaning of intuition. They learned to sense emotional storms before they arrived, and to hold themselves together when others could not offer support. This makes them exceptional partners and friends because they show up consistently, listen deeply, and offer the kind of empathy that can only be shaped by lived experience. But it also makes them vulnerable because their steady love stands next to a fear that the people they care about might one day disappear the same way others once did. Small acts of carelessness, forgetfulness, inconsistency, and emotional distance can pierce their hearts more sharply than intentional harm. Not because they are fragile, but because those small breaks mirror wounds they worked hard to heal. Their love is a paradox of strength and tenderness. They give without hesitation, trust with their whole being once they feel safe, and carry an inner loyalty that does not waver even in difficulty. But this same loyalty becomes their soft spot, because when they commit fully. And when they lose someone, they lose them deeply. They do not know how to love halfway. Their hearts are all or nothing, shaped by years of learning that genuine connection is rare and should be protected. When they sense distance, they do not become angry, they become afraid. When they sense inconsistency, they do not assume indifference, they assume danger. And when they love someone, they love with an intensity that reflects all the versions of themselves that survived the past. Yet inside that fear lies tremendous spiritual wisdom. People who fear abandonment are not broken, they are awakening. Their spiritual awakening begins the moment they realize that their sensitivity is not a burden, but a guide, leading them toward healing, connection, and self-understanding. They begin to see that not every inconsistency means loss. Not every silence means rejection. And not every shift in energy means someone is leaving. They learn to distinguish the voice of past wounds from the reality of present love. And gradually, they discover that stability can be built within, not only sought in others. Their journey is not about avoiding abandonment. It is about learning that they no longer need to abandon themselves. If this message about loving deeply, yet fearing abandonment resonates with you, comment, "I am healing," below your voice matters, and your story helps others feel less alone. 8. Their pain becomes wisdom and compassion. Their pain becomes wisdom and compassion, not because suffering is kind, but because they refuse to let it break them. Instead of hardening their hearts, they grow. They reflect, analyze, and quietly transform every wound into insight. Each hurt becomes a lesson, and each lesson becomes a deeper understanding of themselves and the world around them. Through this inner work, they become emotionally literate, able to recognize, name, and navigate complex feelings rather than be controlled by them. Their spirituality and spiritual development do not come from escape, but from the courage to face what hurts and still choose awareness, balance, and growth. What appears from the outside as a quiet presence is actually profound inner strength. Behind their calm is a long history of storms survived in silence, tears learned to be carried with dignity, and disappointment turned into clarity. They do not need to speak loudly to prove their power. Their energy is steady, grounded, and deeply reassuring. Because they have known loneliness, confusion, and emotional loss firsthand, their empathy is not theoretical, it is lived. They listen without rushing to fix, understand without needing to judge, and hold space without demanding anything in return. Over time, they naturally become lighthouses for others, not by trying to save anyone, but by simply being who they have become. Their life itself is proof that pain does not have to end in bitterness. They turn survival into service, offering presence instead of perfection, understanding instead of advice, and compassion instead of control. People feel safe around them, not because they pretend everything is fine, but because they know what it means when everything is not fine, and they did not give up on themselves. Their journey shows that wisdom is not inherited. It is earned through reflection, endurance, and emotional honesty. Compassion is not weakness. It is strength refined through suffering. And spiritual development is not an escape from pain. It is the ability to walk through it with awareness, dignity, and purpose. Their life becomes a quiet reminder that even the deepest wounds, when faced with truth and courage, can become sources of light, not only for the self, but for everyone who crosses their path. In the end, Carl Jung reminds us that those who have endured too much are not broken, they are forged. Their depth, resilience, and inner awareness come from pain transformed into wisdom. If this message resonated with your journey, let it be a reminder that your struggles have meaning and your strength is real. If you found value in this reflection, please like, share, and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our future videos on healing, depth, and awakening.